Hello and welcome to this month's edition of African Liberty webinar. AfricanLiberty.org is a project of Students for Liberty Africa. In September 2019, the Fraser Institute published its annual Economic Freedom of the World report. Around the period, the Heritage Foundation released the 2019 Index of Economic Freedom. Both reports are assessments of key indicators that determine the economic condition of the surveyed countries. For consecutive years, though, African countries have poorly ranked in these reports, and unsurprisingly, in the 2019 editions, most of the least free economies in the world are in Sub-Saharan Africa. Well, joining me to make sense of Africa's continued appalling record in economic freedom, Tanja Porcnik, a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute and adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. Ridwan Sorunke is the founder or co-founder and chair of Policy Vote Africa, and Joshua Meservy is the senior Africa policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation. Welcome, everybody. First of all, many of our listeners would like to know why this index of economic freedom is even relevant, because I think it was back in 2015 that I was talking to a colleague, and they said the poorest country in the world is Burundi. And my colleague went to Burundi and he had a good time, and he came back and told me, well, I don't think that index is right, because Burundi that I went to it's nowhere near the poorest country in the world. So if anyone can kindly help us understand or make a sense of the importance of this index, is it even relevant?
It's a very good question, and many people wonder about this, because they see a report like ours, and maybe that's the first time they encounter a report, or sometimes they even for the first time hear about measuring economic freedom, and they wonder what that is, and why economic freedom matters. And you know, before they are informed about what actually economic freedom is, they might never have thought that it matters to them. And actually does matter. It matters to every citizen, no matter where you live around the world. If it's in a wealthy country, if it's just developing country, if it's also in one of the poorest countries in the world. And why does that matter? Is because economic freedom, our economic freedom report measures basically institutions and policies. So the extent that the institutions, the policies of the government allow economic freedom, enable economic freedom of the people. And when I mean what it means, economic freedom is freedom to trade, freedom to basically engage in economic activities as you choose, without unnecessary burden from the government. So a lot of times people think that when we measure economic freedom, we measure economic freedom of multinational companies, like big corporations, they would say. Oh, it's just a measurement of freedom of those large companies. But in fact, economic freedom is, when we measure it, it's economic freedom of every citizen. So basically, whether you are able to engage in trade, in selling or buying a property, actually, if that property is legally secured, meaning if it's the private property is even, you are able to protect it, and if there is a conflict related to your private property, if you are able to appeal to a court and have a independent court adjudicate on that conflict that you have, whether you can register the business, whether you can then operate that business without unnecessary regulation and other restrictions, whether you can then also close the business, whether you can hire someone to work for you, and vice versa, whether you as an individual can engage in can enter into an employment contract without unnecessary restrictions from the government. So basically, economic freedom, why then it matters? So it's not just, as I explained, what we are able now to measure, because we do have measurement of economic freedom. We are able to measure the relationship between economic freedom and other indicators, other components, other desired results that people, of course, look at and would like to see them, for themselves improve. Like, as you mentioned before, one is their income per capita, so how wealthy people are. And in that regard, we see that countries that are just a comparison, so basically countries that are freer tend to be also wealthier. Also, people in those countries have higher incomes per capita, which is significant for countries at the bottom. But then also, when you specifically look at people within those countries that are the poorest, so the 10, as an example, we look at the 10% of the poorest people in countries that we analyze, and we see that there is a significant increase in income per capita for those people, as well as eradication of extreme poverty rates. And that is really important, because it means that economic freedom doesn't, like some people think, like increase levels of economic freedom benefit, the wealthiest people in a society. But if in fact the people that benefit the most are people at the bottom of the income scale.
Great, Tanya. I perfectly agree with you. But Joshua, you've worked on Africa for quite long, and you've also interacted with a lot of top economists on the continent and those in charge of economic policies for the continent. And I want to know, what do you think is the reason, or if there are multiple reasons, what are the reasons why Africa has abysmally ranked in this very important index for quite a while? Why? What are the reasons?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it's the most important question in many ways. Just extraordinary, because they underwent these massive collectivization campaigns and things of that nature. So I think that's one reason. There's still that legacy that has burdened some of these economies, and they're still, frankly, trying to undo some of the damage that was done by these immediate post-colonial experiments with socialism and centralized economies. Corruption is sort of infects everything here, and the problem with corruption and its effect on economic freedom is that it's corruption, or rather centralized economies, make it easier or facilitates corruption, because it centralizes and consolidates wealth and decision making around economic matters into the hands of a few, and that again gives greater opportunity for corruption. And related is this unfortunate trend of authoritarian governance on the continent. Now, this has actually gotten much better since the 90s, where we do have more electoral democracies. There is greater political freedom. I would argue probably in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we've started to see a negative trend, but certainly since the 90s, things have improved. But authoritarian rulers also want to centralize economic planning as much as possible, because that gives them opportunity to skim government revenues and feed their patronage networks that keep them in power. And for an authoritarian ruler, staying in power is the most important thing out of everything. So I think there are those issues. You could even potentially argue that there have been other countries that embrace a centrally planned economy. I'm thinking of the USSR back when it existed, and also China even today, that have set an example for African countries. They engage very closely with African countries and try to convince them that their model, in the current era, the USSR doesn't exist, but so we're probably mostly talking about China here, but their model of sort of limited economic freedom coupled with government repression is the best model for developing countries. That's a case they make frequently. And I think that has had some effect. Hard to quantify. It's hard to measure, but I would say those would be four of the reasons I'd give.
Great. But you see, one of the disturbing facts that come with this ranking is that some of the top rank, in fact, the top rank African country in the 2019 index, I think it's the one from Heritage Foundation. The top rank African country is Rwanda, and the guy in Rwanda, Paul Kagame, of course, is praised by many as the poster boy for African development and African integration. Of course, I agree with some of these policies, but the mere fact that Kagame has been in power for since I can even remember, perhaps since 1994, depends on the way he defines it, bothers me. So if part of the consideration for the Economic Freedom Index is the rule of law, constitutionalism, and toleration of criticism, and some other political or social aspect that reflects with the political economy, so then would you say even if a country has an authoritarian government or a dictator at its leadership, that country still deserves to be ranked very high in the economic index? Joshua and Tanja?
Well, I can answer quickly, and then we can move to Tanja. Yeah, so I think Mauritius is actually the best ranked, but you're right, Rwanda is ranked very highly and has been moving up in these rankings. The rankings are not perfect. They use a certain set of metrics that are only as good as the data that feeds them. A place like Rwanda is actually hard to get good data. There's speculation, I think fairly well founded, that some of the economic data out of Rwanda is cooked, where it's made to look better than it actually is by the government.
I would not be surprised.
Yeah, right. I mean, it would fit, right? Like it wouldn't be surprising, as you say. And so these, we think the Index of Economic Freedom is a great tool, but we would be the first people to caution everyone that it's not perfect and it has flaws. And I think that Rwanda and other authoritarian style governments that are granting a little bit of economic freedom are really interesting case studies in whether, economic freedom will lead to political liberalization, or if you actually can have political repression coupled with levels of economic freedom, if those can coexist, indefinitely. And of course, the greatest experiment here is China. This is exactly what China does. So it remains to be seen how this will work out. I really believe that at some point, there's just too many contradictions between political repression and economic freedom, that at some point these systems will not be able to continue and they'll have to go fully one way or the other.
Tanja?
Yes, thank you. So similar to what we just heard, on our index, Mauritius ranks first. And it's important to always stress when we talk about reports, like both of these reports that are mentioned today, it's that there is a certain metrics. You also are limited to measuring, we use only third-party source data, which means that we can measure whatever data exists, so we can use only that data. So there are limitations to that, but then at the same time, as it was mentioned earlier, we also don't measure political freedom. And when it comes to authoritarian regimes, and the biggest problems with the authoritarian regimes is their attack on political rights. So we don't measure that aspect of free society. But as mentioned earlier, the report like ours provides an opportunity to assess the relationship between political freedom and economic freedom. We do see that there is a positive relationship between these two categories, which means that most likely when a country moves down on one of these rankings, the other side follows. So meaning if a country starts deteriorating on one of these parameters, you will see also deterioration on the other one. But the thing is that sometimes it takes a while, so it's not necessary that you see a decline. But that doesn't mean that if on economic freedom a country doesn't drop, that the drop on the other measurement is not worrisome, that we shouldn't be highlighting it. So it doesn't mean that if a country does well on economic freedom and there are other problems in a country, that other problems shouldn't be highlighted. But at the same time, I think there is a value in highlighting good practices, when institutions do work, when they do enable people to engage in terms of economic freedom in economic activities. It's important to highlight that, because that is of great importance to every citizens of that country.
All right. And I think it's from the Fraser Institute report in the last 5 years or 4 years that I think that I've seen a pattern among the least ranked African countries. And I think Angola and Congo specifically have been ranked among the least. The only other, in fact, the least ranked countries are all African countries except Iraq, Syria, and Venezuela. And among those African countries are Angola and Congo. But Angola and Congo are two of the most resource country, or the wealthiest countries in Africa. And I just cannot imagine how you can have so much abundance in wealth and at the same time be ranked among the poorest country and also the least economic tolerating country on the continent. So what do you think is the problem with these well-resourced African countries with abundant resources and minerals deposit and economic prosperity?
Well, if I may answer, so natural resources a lot of times a curse, just like foreign aid. They can basically distort incentives. Also, I would say government with their institutions and policies specifically, the government goes in a wrong direction. So instead of providing institutions and public policies that will foster economic growth and lead to development, they do just the opposite. And that is reflected in low levels of economic freedom. And as you mentioned earlier, on our index, actually more than half of African countries that we rank fall in the fourth quartile. And as mentioned earlier, also I believe 7 of them in the bottom 10 are African countries, and also in the bottom 20, 15 of them. And I think that is a alarming sign, because unless you improve economic freedom, and no matter if you have natural resources or not, you are not going to see economic progress, or at least not to such an extent that you could see it. And a good example that was given before by Joshua is former Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, so basically former socialist economies, that after the Iron Curtain fell, they have turned their policies around. They have, they were determined to move toward the markets, liberalize their economies, move toward economic freedom. And what we have seen with these countries, it's not just in the last 3 decades that they have improved economic freedom, but also their economies have just went in a completely different direction, and they have developed. They have attracted foreign direct investments. Their unemployment rates have dropped significantly. Also, poverty has been reduced significantly. So these economies are now in a completely different shape than they used to be, as well as governance has improved. And other indicators. So this could be a good, I would say, good example for African countries to follow. I wouldn't follow China and India, but there is a lot that African countries could do, and I think it is just a matter of time when there will be a consensus within these countries that they should turn around their trend and move away from socialism and centralized economies toward free markets.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I spent a considerable amount of number of my first year, especially growing up and undergrad in Africa. And towards the end of my undergrad, I moved across the West African region, and I saw the enormity of regulations and problems that local farmers, for instance, go through. For instance, I've lived with farmers that cannot compete with foreign, substitutes. And one of the things that I think they usually stress, of course, promoted by the government, is that the best way to help these farmers or African entrepreneurs is by courting importation, protectionism, or placing a huge embargo or tariff on foreign imported goods. And this, of course, in itself is economic regulation, which is a huge consideration in your index, I can assume. So will you say, I'm talking to Ridwan now, will you say considering the precarity of the economic situation of African entrepreneurs, that African entrepreneurs need their government to regulate the economy or protect them from foreign goods or not? Joshua or Tanja, any one of you can take the question pending the time we're going to be available.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think obviously there's a bare minimum of government regulation that's necessary just to ensure the coherent and free working of an economy. You need courts to enforce contracts, things of that nature. But as far as protecting local industries, I would say no. If you have the proper regulatory framework, if you have a free and open economy, then that will allow a country's citizens to either create their own products that can compete with these new.
I think we lost Joshua's audio there. Ridwan, if you are back with us now, can you please answer the question? Okay. Tanja.
So yes, so if I may just continue where Joshua was disappeared, because I agree with what Joshua was saying. So to me, the biggest problem in African country when it comes to rule of law is that private property is not secured. And for that reason, a lot of people end up in informal shadow economy. So they operate behind the scene, like somewhere, that no one sees them or actually can even know what they are doing. But that is harming them the most. It's not just harming, of course, government that is dependent on tax revenues, but also these small business owners and entrepreneurs that end up, working in informal economy because, as studies show, their businesses don't do as well as businesses in formal economy. They don't grow as fast. They don't produce as much. They don't hire as many people. They don't, of course, because they don't have access to banking sector. So basically, they cannot get a loan. Their business cannot grow, develop. Sometimes their business cannot even start. So there are estimates that in African countries, informal economy is as big as 60 to all the way to 80%. And to the rest of the world, this is unimaginable. This is more than half of the economy is, somewhere hidden, somewhere trying not to be recorded for reasons that are high taxations, cumbersome regulation. And so if government was actually paying attention, these governments would reduce regulatory burden. They would secure property rights and also enforce property rights. This is very important, as Joshua mentioned before. Property needs to be secured, and they have to be courts that are independent, and where you can, if a contract is breached, where you can actually appeal and get a fair verdict. And this matters not just between two entrepreneurs, but also in the relationship between entrepreneur and a customer. So the customer also wants to purchase goods and services from someone that is operating in a formal economy, because that also means that customer is going to be protected. And not to mention foreign companies that want to, of course, do business with companies that are registered in that country, that that have all the papers, that everything is in order. So this is a huge hindrance to growth and to growth of all these businesses. And if we then, add corruption that is creating a big chaos because of all these rules that exist for citizens to have a business, to run a business, to grow a business, I think this is the biggest and the most significant problem that in African countries, entrepreneurs and small business owners have to endure.
Mm-hmm. Great. So, Ridwan, one of the things that you perhaps observe yourself while still in Nigeria is that, and of course West Africa, is that during business transaction between two people in the informal sector, there is always a tendency that one of them might not keep to contract, and eventually one of the partners will lose in the business. And this, of course, is an absence, because of an absence of contract enforcement, or what you want to call a set of law that guide contract. And if you want to invite the government to, or any form of agency to mediate between two parties engaging in a business within the market, that of course is, as we know in Africa, going to lead to more regulation. So with that in mind, would you say, or would you not say, that recommendations for regulation are sensible for Africa's economy to progress in light of the burden of regulation in these economies?
So first of all, I think that regulations are important, but it's important that the governments get them right. Dispute settlement remains a very big barrier, especially at the level of the SMEs. And then that's what organizations like World Bank, and I also see that on Heritage Banking, saying that property rights is also important. So when you think about dispute resolution, when you think about property rights, you still need that judiciary context to make this happen. But as the economies in this across countries in Africa continue to expand, what I see that would happen would be an evolution of the dispute resolution structure. So right now in a country like Nigeria, there's been an informal alternative dispute resolution structure. So you think about SMEs operating in the informal sector, adopting informal alternative dispute resolution structure. So as governments, continue to as government fail to deliver in that part of ensuring that contract settlements, dispute resolution, the rule of law is actually enforced within these countries, I see more people moving towards adopting alternative dispute structure, which would spontaneously evolve as market forces interact. And that's what's happening when you look at the bottom 10% of the SME structure, especially people working in the informal sector. They've had a structure in place for years whereby it's even independent of the government. So they've learned to resolve disputes amongst themselves. But when you move from just the informal sector to the formal sector, then that's the big challenge. are there formal mechanisms of actually settling disputes? And that's the big issue. And when you think about, even this new trade agreement that they are talking about currently, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, that's like one of the biggest issues, dispute resolution. How do you settle disputes, cross border? And I think that it's important for governments across, Africa to start to think about, rule of law in a different perspective, and more from the market perspective. How do we ensure that, rule of law within the country is high level? How do we ensure that dispute resolution and settlement is enforced, and then how do we ensure that we work closely with the business to ensure that disputes, property rights, and rule of law is actually implemented across markets.
Well, you see, I've interacted with a lot of individuals in Africa that will say the best way to help African entrepreneurs is through regulations. But I fundamentally disagree with some of the propositions. And I want to ask Joshua, do you agree with the proposition by Ridwan for regulation of, contracts and the business environment in Africa?
Yeah, well, again, you do need some minimum. Investor is not going to invest in a country if he or she believes that their partner, whomever it may be, could break a contract and they would have no recourse to retrieve their money or compel their partner to honor the contract. So yeah, you absolutely do need that, and there are other examples here, like protecting property rights, as Tanja was talking about, and others. Property rights are critical. There's been a lot of work and research done on this particular topic, and it's shown that if people have free and clear title to their land, they're much more willing to collateralize it, so then they can perhaps start a small business with using their land as collateral, or they're just willing to improve the land. It makes perfect sense. You don't want to put a lot of your resources and energy into something that you may lose arbitrarily if you don't have free and clear title. So, but I would be very cautious if our entrepreneurs about pushing for more regulation, because regulations can sound great on paper, they can be well intentioned, but we have so many examples of regulation having a whole host of unintended negative consequences. So I think that, again, what government should be providing is the bare minimum level of regulation that will allow people to create businesses, which will create jobs, to pursue their economic dreams. Look, when you go across Africa, right, and the entrepreneurial spirit is undeniable, and there are so many people out there who are striving and have great ideas and are, I'm convinced, would be extraordinary entrepreneurs if they lived in an environment where they had a chance to put those skills and those aspirations to real use. Unfortunately, that's just not what you have in a lot of African countries and other countries, but we're talking about Africa here. And that's what the Index of Economic Freedom measurements that we've been talking about, both my organization and Tanya's, reflect.
So, Tanya, do you agree with the fact that there should be some form of regulation, or even if you agree, what should be the guiding principle to regulating businesses in Africa?
Well, of course, as was mentioned earlier by Joshua, there is definitely some minimum regulation that is needed to just make, the whole process work, and that everything is transparent, that it's, things are clear, and that there is a recourse in case of there is a dispute, that someone is harmed, because that's also very important, because if either party is harmed by the transaction, there has to be a way to have a recourse. So that's really important. But then, and also in general, I would say, regulation that entails like safety of the products, and information about the products. But when it depends. But when what we measure actually, that's what's important about indices like ours, is that we measure when government does too much, meaning when government and it can be regulation or it can be with other institutions, when it does just way too much and it starts hampering on economic freedom. So we don't measure those regulations where government is justified to provide that kind of regulatory framework. So we just measure when the government goes overboard, I would say, when it starts attacking economic freedom of their citizens. If we measured where government does well, then that's not what we measure. We measure economic freedom, not the opposite. But yes, as it was mentioned before, the government needs to be very careful. But let me just conclude that government often, if it's like, if the government is listening to its citizens, the government does what the citizens expect the government to do. So if there is if we are talking about a fairly democratic society, there we will have the government will reflect what the citizens want the government to do, meaning that the understanding that too much regulation, cumbersome regulation, regulation of every aspect of economic activity is harming people, is harming their progress, is harming the development of the country. So people need to first understand that, and then when people do understand it, then they will appeal to the government to change policies and institutions. So sometimes people forget that the government just does what people want government to do. So a lot of times there has to be understanding also among the people what direction the government should go, and only after that understanding is reached, we can then expect that government will move in a certain direction, maybe in a completely different direction.
So I'm talking to Ridwan right now. One of the narrative from the Heritage Foundation and Fraser Institute and even Cato Institute about the poor ranking of African countries and other countries in the world in this economic freedom index is about regulations that they need to deregulate their economy. So Ridwan, I want to ask you, do you agree, do you fundamentally agree with the fact that free market or deregulation of economy or absolutely free market reforms is actually the best alternative for African countries? Do you agree with the free market alternative?
That's a very difficult question to answer because I think that just like Tanja has mentioned, there needs to be a bit of regulation. I think that African economies needs to move towards free markets. I think so. I think that, but there has to be some level of regulation. I think that what's happening on the continent with an expanded market structure in the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement means that the continent is trying to appreciate some concept of free market economy as well. So, which means that trying to deregulate some structures. But I still think that there are some critical concepts like property rights that still needs to be enforced by the government. And just like Tanja has mentioned, that the government should do what they are asked to do by the citizen in a perfectly functional democracy. I think that it's important that the government moves away from socialism. That I know. And I think that when you look at countries like Nigeria, you can't really categorize it, except in some instances. There are times whereby, the government definitely moves away from concept of socialism and move towards free market. And there are times, especially in the last couple of years, whereby it's been towards the other part. So that's something I would advocate for. But I think that there has to be a functional government who's upholding principles of regulations that are important for the businesses to prosper. And then more importantly would be that principles of regulations that are actually important for SMEs to flourish. And just like Joshua has mentioned, that we shouldn't over-regulate, definitely. And I'll give you a typical example of the fintech sector in Nigeria. It has lots of barriers, and I think that by having government create some sort of regulatory sandbox where you can easily have these fintech SMEs, small and medium-sized players to actually evolve without having too much regulatory barriers. That's a different one entirely, and I think that's a way that we've been canvassing for locally to have it's kind of a structure whereby government steps back a bit and allow the market to flourish without having to deal with lots of regulatory barrier. But I wouldn't say that there should be full deregulation of the market. No.
I do agree that African government has a lot to do with helping their own economies grow, but also we cannot hide from the fact that economies these days seem not to be only on the macro level. In fact, macroeconomics determine a lot about the economic progress of a country, and that's going to bring me to the role of international players or international partners in Africa. And Joshua, you were there when the former secretary John Bolton made this or revealed the Trump Africa strategy, and one of the key spirits, as the Trump government usually use the word, the spirits of the Trump Africa strategy is a gradual withdrawal of America's hand in many phases of the African life. And we also saw a sort of rhetoric promoted by Ghana's Nana Akufo-Addo about Western economies leaving Africa to determine its own economic future, but that does not relate to working in partnership with them. So this brings to question: what do you think should be the extent to which foreign partners like America, the EU, or even let's say the World Bank and the IMF work with Africa or influence the African economic policies? Based off the fact that majority of these African governments cannot even design sound economic policies. What should be the ideal role of the international community?
Thank you. So my take on this is that it's a very important question because it's going to address something that I think we haven't mentioned before and we should mention, which is free trade. So when we measure economic freedom, we measure also whether people in a certain country are able to trade freely, not just within the country, but also internationally. And this comes back to your question, which is what other countries like United States, also countries in the European Union and other countries around the world could actually do to I would say to help but indirectly, I would say, not directly, because I'm not talking about foreign aid, but I'm talking about having more free flow of capital and also more free trade toward African countries. That is something that all these countries could do, and it would greatly benefit countries in Africa. And this is really unfortunate because on one hand, these countries are closing their markets to producers from Africa, and restricting, with trade barriers, with other barriers. They are also subsidizing their own producers, which greatly is at a disadvantage of producers from Africa. And my take would be, if these countries really cared about African economies and African people and wanted to, put them on the same level playing field, they would actually have a free trade with these countries in Africa. They would also have free flow of capital with these countries, and that would have enormous economic benefit to everyone living in Africa.
Oh, great! Very, very rightly said. I cannot agree any more with you, but I want to know. I just want to get the perspective of Josh because he was there when the U.S. government reviewed its Africa policy. So Joshua, if you can hear me, what do you think should be the extent to which the U.S. government and other Western partners, influence the economic policies of the African governments? All right, I think. Okay, good. Good. We can hear you now. Go ahead.
Okay. All right. Great. Yeah. The U.S. has had success with its own economy by harnessing the free markets, and there's a very, very strong correlation between, as we've been talking throughout this episode, between free markets and wealth and prosperity. There's very few instances of countries becoming prosperous without economic freedom and free markets and capitalism. So I think the U.S. can advocate for that model, and it should advocate for that model with African countries, especially because there is a debate within some of these countries about which model they want to choose. So I think there's a role there for African policymakers to encourage African countries to embrace the same sort of system that's brought prosperity throughout the globe in many different contexts. I absolutely agree with Tanja. Free trade it benefits everybody. It's a great global good. More of it is almost always better. So I think that's one area that could always be improved. I'm actually hopeful that the Trump administration is serious about trying to not withdraw from the continent, but reorient and recalibrate the focus of American engagement with the continent, because right now it's primarily security matters and humanitarian assistance. And both those things are important, but I think the true focus should be encouraging American businesses to invest on the continent, encouraging African countries to rationalize their regulatory environments, to become more welcoming to investment and business, to help maybe, going back to Tanja's point, to strike some free trade agreements. I would be happy to see the U.S. try to help the continent with this continental-wide free trade agreement that most countries have signed on to. I think that could be hugely positive. There's big barriers. It's going to be very, very difficult to implement that, particularly because a lot of the regional economic communities haven't done very well. They haven't integrated as they're supposed to. But if you could get the continent-wide free trade agreements, it would be extraordinarily beneficial, primarily to Africans, but also to the world. It would facilitate trade globally. It would make Africa a more attractive investment environment, all of these things. So I think that it should be the focus of Western and American engagement on the continent. Free trade, investments, these things they're proven to be the best poverty alleviators. It's the most dignified way out of poverty. It's the sustainable way out of poverty. That's what the U.S. should be focused on.
So Ridwan, if you can hear me, do you agree with Tanja and Joshua's recommendation for the role of the governments of foreign partners in Africa, policy-wise? Ridwan, can you hear me?
Yes, I think that just like Tanja and Josh have both mentioned, it's important that foreign players support this current free trade agreement continent-wide. I think that the US has been a very supportive player to Africa in the past administration. We had AGOA, and then President Trump's policy, which is like Prosper Africa, is still in the works. And I think that when you think about Prosper Africa, you kind of think about the fact that it's really moved away from just foreign aid to more of creating like deal teams where you have interagency collaboration across the State Department, Commerce, USDR, trying to support the continent. But I think that what is lacking right now is the fact that there needs to be an increased support for the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, because, as just as mentioned, when you have a continent-wide free trade agreement, what you have happen is that the prices of goods will drop. And when prices of goods drop, what happens is that consumers have more disposable income, and then ultimately you start to see countries across the continent specializing in their areas of comparative advantage. And that's why, when you have, United States as powerful as they are, the European Union, and also countries in the East, it's important that, everyone support Africa to become the wider market of, three, about 3 billion consumers, and more importantly, have a situation where goods are able to flow easily across the continent. Because right now, it's cheaper to import goods from China into a place like Nigeria than you would have ship a good from Nigeria to Egypt, because there is so much barrier. And then when you think about the trade corridors, apart from the East Africa trade corridor, I think that the West Africa trade corridor isn't really great. There's so much infrastructure barriers. South Africa is doing really well, but it's important for us to connect these regional communities and create, a massive market in Africa, and also increase intra-Africa trade. Because at the end of the day, when you have Africa trading with each other, then the dependence on external forces would change rapidly, and then you can start to think about a situation whereby we trade with other parts of the world as a bloc, rather than promoting bilateral trade agreements with the 54 countries in Africa.
Rightly said. And I want to drag us, to one of the points that, is one of the obvious points of economic freedom is that the least free countries tend to be the poorest countries, and the most free countries tend to be the richest countries. So it will not be surprising to many of our listeners that the least ranked African countries are among the poorest countries on the continent. And this brings me to the question of, if part of the recommendations or the body language that we've seen by Africans and the African governments recently about eradicating poverty is for the government to provide welfare schemes, and to regulate the economy, to protect the local farmers, for the local entrepreneurs, more regulations, more welfare plans to solve poverty. And you saying poverty is one of the consequences of when your country is ranked low in the economic freedom. So having these 2 points in mind, how best will you say or will you recommend for the African government to go about eradicating poverty, but not at the same time triggering further problems in the economic freedom spectrum? Tanja, if you want to take the question, please.
Well, the governments should be doing just the opposite, what you have just laid out. So they should increase economic freedom, and with that, they will decrease poverty rates. So that would be, in one sentence, what they should do. And how they can do that, of course, it varies from a country to a country. African country, the continent has many countries, and they vary, as you mentioned, not just in terms of their level of economic freedom, but also in terms of their economic development, economic growth, and for that reason, they're where they are not doing that well in terms of economic freedom. It's different. So each country has to look at or Joshua's or our report and see where their economic freedom level is much lower in comparison to other neighboring countries. Like neighboring countries are the countries in Africa, because that's where most economic activity across the border occurs for their citizens. And then they have to strengthen that area. So, of course, there are common problems like rule of law, protection of property rights, and too much regulation. But of course, each country should look at where they could increase economic freedom. And as I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, that's because higher levels of economic freedom don't benefit just country as a whole, or those people in the economy that are doing better than others at the moment, but actually higher levels of economic freedom benefit the most people at the bottom of the income scale. So basically people that are below poverty line, and even going to the extreme poverty lines. So if these countries are serious about helping people that are at the bottom, they should look into how to increase economic freedom.
Great. So one of the I don't want to say non-economic factors considered in this index by Fraser specifically is about proper. I don't want to say property right. To put it rightly, the rule of law. And many wouldn't consider rule of law, for instance, to be a key determinant in the economic freedom spectrum of a specific country. For instance, Rwanda, as I said again, is one of the higher countries, and the rule of law in that country is one of the best in the world. So if that is a key consideration on the economic freedom index, and we see Rwanda ranked high, wouldn't that be a body language or a sort of encouragement to other African, countries to just, disregard the constitution or the rule of law and just implement policies and, put their hands on ground just to make sure the economy is right? So do you not think ranking high countries like Rwanda will encourage, the abdication or disregard of economic freedom and also of human rights and, other things related to the rule of law? Joshua?
Yeah, I think that Rwanda is ranked pretty well despite the repression of the government, not because of the repression of the government. Rule of law does not at all mean stripping individuals of their rights, of their political rights, which is unfortunately what's happening too frequently in Rwanda. Rule of law means enforcing the just and regulations and statutes that have been enacted by a representative government. To me, that's what rule of law means. So I think if people do take comfort, or if they take inspiration, let's say, from President Kagame in Rwanda, because Rwanda is ranked very high, I think that's a mistake. Again, Rwanda has managed to improve its economic environment, its economic freedom. It's done better on the ease of doing business index, all those metrics, not because of the repression, but in spite of it. And that's for a whole unique set of circumstances. And as I said earlier in the show, we're also not sure how accurate some of the data out of Rwanda is. In fact, there's good reason to be suspicious of a fair amount of it. So these rankings in these international indices are only as good as the data that feed them. So if the data is bad, flawed, patchy, whatever, then the rankings are not going to be as accurate as they could be. So centrally planned economies, they have a history of spectacular failure. It's incontrovertible that particularly modern economies are too complex to be planned with any sort of efficiency, because the number of decisions that you have to make just in an hour in a huge modern economy would overwhelm any planner. So the market is able to most efficiently allocate resources. It's able to organically make those decisions rather than try to have a small cadre of people grasp the full complexity of an economy and allocate resources and things of that nature. And that's not what's happening in Rwanda either. There's political repression, but there's been loosening around some of the economic issues. I hope the latter trend continues, and I hope the former trend reverses. I think that then you'll really see Rwanda take off. I think they would be doing much better, actually, than they are if there were more political freedoms granted in that country.
Ridwan, what do you think?
I think that Josh is completely right. I just add like a bit of a different line of thought, just very different to some extent, and that's really more. I would like to like think about. So there is this, one of my professors called Brian Levy, and then his line of thought really thinking about rule of law. It's that most times dominant discretionary countries do not necessarily lack rule of law. So in that way, when you think about the fact that it's an autocracy, what you think about is the fact that there is rule by law. So when you think about the economy, and when you think about the business sense, think about the fact that there is government integrity to some extent in a country um, you know the government of Kagame. There is that government integrity. However, I'm not saying that I'm endorsing autocracy. I'm a strong advocate of democracy. But what you have in that kind of economy is rule by law. So, which means that investors' confidence, to some extent, is quite high, understanding that over the years there's been some level of standard within the country. This doesn't mean that African governments should adopt this kind of approach. And I'm sure in this ranking there are other parameters that have been put into context. All are rate at the same level, and they're not necessarily saying that the style of government have contributed to what has happened in Kagame's country. It's not the best country economically on the continent right now. But just to mention that there is rule by law happening in Rwanda, and then that may actually um, trigger some investors' confidence, especially development agencies, and then people actually investing in sectors like agriculture or other natural resource-based sector in the country.
Hmm, very interesting. So, Tanya, why do you think the Fraser Institute puts such a big premium on the consideration of the rule of law in their rankings?
Well, because without rule of law, all other freedoms are in jeopardy. So, of course, yes, you can have a situation where a country would have really weak rule of law, and you would still have, if you measure it, you would see citizens are enjoying other freedoms, but it just might happen that those freedoms will be attacked eventually because country has a weak rule of law. So in a sense, rule of law many times is a precondition for citizens to enjoy other freedoms. And a lot of times, maybe you can have certain freedom on a paper, but then if that freedom is not protected by independent courts and the system that has integrity, and that also that police is reliable and so forth. So basically that you as a person and your property is protected, then all other freedoms might not matter to you. Or you might think they have less value to you because you are not protected and your property is not protected. So for that reason, rule of law is, I don't see an index of economic freedom without a component that measures rule of law. But I will mention that rule of law is a very broad category, and if you measure it within the context of economic freedom, you don't really measure everything. As we know, there are various indices out there, really good ones that measure rule of law, and we don't take everything that they measure. So if anyone is interested in the entire scope of rule of law, I would advise that person to go and look at the rule of law index or the World Bank's measurement. That is my take on it. That even though we try to measure as broad as possible when it comes to economic activities of people, we don't measure everything. And as it was earlier mentioned, it pertains to contract. It pertains to your activity with your business. It also pertains to your ability to just do business with foreigners and have a recourse. So it's a to me it's a cornerstone of economic freedom.
One of the things I will say it's perhaps the most interesting, or one of the most interesting things I've had from economists in Africa is that why can Africa not take cue from the best the best economy in the world in their mind, which is China. And we know many of the enterprises in China, in fact, not all, many enterprises in China are controlled by the government, which brings into question the extent or to what level should the government exist, the size of government, the if we need a limited government or a big government. So a big government or a big size government like China is getting things done in China. And you come to Africa, you ask an African, as George Aike will say, you ask an African government or a leader to address poverty, they will open the Ministry of Poverty Reduction, or ask them to make their people happy. They will open the Ministry of Happiness, like we've seen in some states in Nigeria. So if there is an enormous work to be done in Africa, and one of the key consideration on the economic index or economic freedom index is the size of the government. How do you expect African governors or African leaders or presidents to address these challenges with very few, welfare plans, with very few employees, with very few spendings? Where are they going to get the capacity from or the money from if you are encouraging or asking them to limit their government capacity or limit the size of their government? I'm specifically asking the man from Heritage Foundation and Tanja from Fraser, because your organization have promoted this idea of limited government.
Sure, yeah. That as you grant more economic freedom, you won't need as much government. And so as far as a capacity question, I think, if you have fewer regulations, you won't need much bureaucracy and things of that nature. So, and then this, I know this is a really hot debate on the continent about the Chinese model. And people do look at the success that Chinese people have enjoyed in rising out of poverty over the last 20 years, hundreds of millions of people. But I always encourage people to not just view history back 20 years, but view history back even 50 years. And the Chinese government killed millions of its own people in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And China was a massively impoverished country, and it still suffers from poverty, unfortunately, in areas. So I think what happened in China was that the Chinese leadership actually realized that they destroyed their country with their central planning and with their massive repression, and they started to loosen up on the economic side of things. Now they maintain a massive government to repress people politically, but they have adopted this hybrid model of some economic freedoms coupled with this political repression. So I very much disagree that the lesson of China is that a large government is necessary to draw people out of poverty. I think China actually teaches us the opposite, that once the Chinese government decided to allow its people some measure of economic freedom, the Chinese people, despite the Chinese Communist Party, were able to create wealth for themselves. I think that's the lesson of China. And I would argue, just like I did in Rwanda, that if you had an even freer economy in China and a less repressive government, you would see China achieving even greater heights than they have currently. Look, you can look at economic history, and it's incontrovertible truth that freer systems, economic systems and political systems, are strongly correlated with wealth and prosperity. So, at the time of independence, when the independence wave started in Africa, there were a number of African countries who had a higher per capita GDP than Japan, than South Korea, and some of these other Asian tigers. And now those countries, Japan, South Korea, you could look at the East German experience when they came out from under communism, the Eastern Bloc, same thing after the USSR disbanded. They made extraordinary progress because they adopted the model of economic, not perfectly, no country has adopted it perfectly, obviously, but that was the aspiration, was to grant their citizens economic freedom, frequently coupled with political freedom. Those have a mutually beneficial dynamic, I would say. And now, look at Japan. It's an extraordinarily prosperous country. Same with South Korea. It's extraordinarily prosperous. And that's because they looked to models that already worked. And they did not go to the failed models of centrally planned economies, of economically unfree economies. So I know people look at China, and it is impressive, some of the things that China has done, absolutely. But I think they take the wrong lessons from China. The lesson from China is that the Chinese government, after destroying its country, the Chinese Communist Party, after destroying its country, eventually granted some level of economic freedom that allowed the Chinese people to create wealth despite the heavy hand of the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, that's really great. But Ridwan, you recently moved back to Africa, and you spent a good amount of time here in the US, and you saw the level at which governments or state officials or agencies appreciate this sort of reports or surveys or rankings. So will you say African governments appreciate this sort of reports the same way other governments appreciate them? Okay, Ridwan, can you hear me?
Okay, yes, I can hear you now. I think that, in all fairness, they do appreciate these reports because what these reports do is that they place spotlight on the government. So, and then I think that as much as I do that that's something that the government really does in terms of the press, in terms of not necessarily only the press, but in terms of looking at the reality. So they do that, they read that, but it's a different ballgame. You can't. It's a different ballgame. When you view the report, when they criticize for a while. But I think that it's important that we move away from just reading the reports or appreciating these reports to actually implementing the recommendations from this report. And when I looked at this economic freedom index report, one thing I saw was really around education, and I think that it's really important that the components around the education are implemented, because it's extremely important that as we continue to build government capacity, we also need to think about the quality of people that are being recruited into government. They understand the concept of free trade. They understand the concept of open market economics, or free market, just to say. So it's important that we build capacity, we invest in education, and I think that not just, like I mentioned earlier, not just appreciating or reading this report, but actually implementing the recommendations from this report.
Wise enough. And normally I wouldn't ask this kind of soft question, but I gotta put it to Tanja. So one of our followers on Twitter just asked me directly that why should African countries concern themselves with ranking by foreign organizations to telling Africa what to do? This is neo-imperialism. What do you say?
It is not telling anyone what to do. It's actually, the report is not supposed to tell you what to do. It's basically supposed to just tell you what you could do and what you could achieve if you do that. So it's not really telling you, of course, because we have no authority over anyone. It's information, and if I'm addressing this person that just asked a question. If you want to take this information, great. If you don't want to take it, also great. But the fact is that if you take this information might help you in your country to be more prosperous, to grow, to develop. and for you to be freer as an individual, as a business owner, to have more responsible government, for government to actually work for you rather than to work for the elite. And goes back to the question that was just asked earlier and posed to Josh, that was answering. So it's not just that the history shows why economic freedom matters and why it is good for the countries to move toward greater levels of economic freedom, and of course the markets and liberal economy, however you define this economic freedom. So, but the fact is that if you stay back, so if you stay on the side of socialism, or basically having a lot of regulation, big government, economy that is filled with companies that are state-owned, you will eventually end up with one very, very tiny elite benefiting from that kind of economic system, and the rest of the country suffering or basically being left behind. So the question is whether citizens want an economic system that benefits everybody, that actually provides opportunity to everybody in the same degree, or it wants to have an economic system that benefits political and economic elite. And we know that this is less than 1%. So basically everyone that is in the government, they're friends, so basically cronies. And I personally come from, I was born in Eastern Europe, and I am old enough to remember the old system, and also the transition that is in some countries has been quick, but in some countries has been going really slow. So moving from socialism, from countries with really low level of economic freedom to markets, to having more economic freedom. And I know how I know what it does to have more economic freedom, and how appreciated people are when they have more economic freedom. So this is my answer to the person. If it is information that we are providing, and I hope you will look into it. And if you have further questions, please do contact me directly, and I would be happy to answer.
Good enough. So in the spirit of not telling African governments what to do, but in the spirit of encouraging African government about what they could do, as she said, what will you say should be the direct policy, or sort of an highlight of the policy pathway for African economies to move away from this? I don't want to call it something that I wouldn't like to hear later. Poor economic ranking to performing well economically, and also on the ranking. So in 60 seconds, Joshua, can you give us your policy recommendations for any sensible African governments to emulate or consider?
I think that for me, the quality of the government matters. I think that I agree with everyone that government shouldn't overregulate. I think that government's function, from my perspective, is to be able to create an enabling environment for businesses, both small and medium-sized business to prosper. And then I think that talking about equality, it's really important that the government increase the benchmark of employment in the government, so you have people that have the understanding of what we're talking about, and those people that can actually implement them. Because when you look at emerging markets across the world, and you look at countries that are really doing well, you look at the quality of the government, and you realize that you have very sophisticated individuals at the helms of affairs. You think about how do we ensure that we actually improve the quality of education within the countries, and how do we ensure that people that are actually going to government are smart, sound, and understand basic and complex economic policies that are able to actually implement it. So that's my recommendation in the interview.
Tanja.
So my recommendation would be, of course, it varies from country to country, but in general, it would be to make sure that property rights are secured and strong, that there is free trade, and as much as you can have free trade within the continent, as well as across the globe. When it comes to deregulation, make sure that there are no unnecessary barriers to entry, like licensing and all other regulation. When it comes to tax system, lower lower taxes or simplify them, and that is going to bring those individuals that are currently in informal shadow economy into formal economy, and which is going to benefit everybody. And final recommendation would be to tackle corruption and decrease bureaucracy. So basically, strengthen governance.
Great, Joshua.
I absolutely agree with both. I'll offer maybe a suggestion that's a little off the beaten track, but I would really encourage African governments to allow space for civil society organizations, like your own and like Ridwan's, because it's really truly the African people who are going to have to push the sorts of changes that we've been talking about here. They're going to have to encourage and pressure their governments to adopt some of these reforms and regulations. And like anywhere, if you're trying to implement reform, you need education, and it's organizations like yours that I think are a really critical part of educating people on the continent, because Tanja said it very well in response to the question earlier about why should Africans listen to us. We're just suggesting these are tools that have worked for us, and so we want others to benefit similarly. But we have sort of limited credibility. But people.
That will be it for now for this month's edition of the continued series of African Liberty webinar. And thank you so much.